Hello, my name is Chrissy. I'm an Eastern Gugunyalanji woman, and from my mother's side on the Aboriginal side, and am a Waggle from my father's side in the Torres Strait. I have been working in Indigenous heritage for quite some time, and right across the board, including ethics, following through with FPIC and intellectual property and data sharing agreements and all of those things. So I have been involved in a number of different projects, as you will see. So first of all, I'll show you a map of Australia. This is a map that is been recorded as each colour representing a different tribal group. Some of those languages have been lost, but we did have 250 at least language groups speaking their language across the country. So it's a very big country, and the area that I'll be focusing on is in Queensland, and this is the Great Barrier Reef here, and that is the size of Italy, so you will see that as well. I'm going to talk about rights-based approaches, best practice protocols and guidelines, and some of the positive examples that are coming out. So the rights-based approach, we are signed up to the CBD Convention, and as well as the World Heritage Convention, and those two conventions at the UN level will be a big focus in my presentation. As I said before, the rights-based approach looks at free, prior, informed consent, as well as access and benefit sharing through the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, making sure that benefits are allocated to communities where it is necessary, and looking at, sort of some of the partnerships and that. So for FPIC, just let me say that it's not a once only situation where you just ask for the consent, inform them about, sort of prior information for them to be able to make a decision. You may have to go back and ask for consent again and possibly again, depending on what your project is and where the focus of that project lies. It could be somebody different that you then need to consult. The ethical guidelines at the international, national and community-based levels, the appropriateness of those cultural protocols and agreements of what they should include, and of course the ethical best practice standards. The positive examples, well, we can look at, sort of some of the places where we have not had FPIC undertaken or applied, but after insistence from the Indigenous communities, they feel that they have the rights under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As I mentioned before, beneficial outcomes for all and better protection and conservation. So some of the main things, I was involved in 2014 in an ICOMOS workshop over in Oslo in Norway, and they were specifically doing a rights-based approach survey, study and report for the World Heritage Committee and the World Heritage Centre to apply FPIC to the processes of getting permission from the traditional owners or the Indigenous peoples to put their place on a World Heritage listing. That report was called Our Common Dignity. It was presented to the World Heritage Committee in 2016, and it has been sort of used as an initiative to actually help the World Heritage Committee as well as the Centre in UNESCO to understand and apply FPIC. So that's just what it looks like, World Heritage and rights-based approaches. and they have all the different case studies under there where we have contributed that type of information towards the publication. The benefits for Indigenous peoples in conservation management are things like capacity building, the opportunity to meet with and share knowledge and learn from other Indigenous peoples. That's building the capacity and sharing the skills and passing those skills on. Networking is a great tool for Indigenous peoples to learn what others are doing when they may have a similar situation. We're empowering people to be able to, sort of look after their own health and well-being, but also look after their country by working on their country in a meaningful way. And that way, sort of there's a sharing of the load of making sure that, sort of there's extended time to resolve any issues, but also looking at making sure that time is allowed for them to make a considered decision on the consent of any project. And of course, influencing policy. That's a big one, and a lot of Indigenous people don't have that opportunity to actually, even come near having input into any policy at all. There are challenges for Indigenous peoples, and that's looking at the recognition of Indigenous cultural values at their national level as an outstanding universal value if it was going to go on the World Heritage List. The divide of nature and culture and its interpretation in both conventions. It is looking at, sort of making sure that we minimise that divide as much as possible and really and truly try to reflect that cultural values exist on natural landscapes. There's no getting away from that. And in fact, for Indigenous peoples, it may even be spiritual connections. So it's like intangible, but there's, sort of the connection and relationship they have with that land and their waters. Having control over their nomination when they are nominating for World Heritage listing, many countries just put it up as their own initiative and don't consult the Indigenous peoples when they are putting it up for a World Heritage nomination. When they look at comparative assessments against other mobs' cultural values, that's the way they try to justify whether or not it is of outstanding universal value. So that may be that, sort of, if in my country there is, rock art that is quite significant to us, and it tells a story, sort of the time that they have been on country. So, rock art engravings have got things that are no longer exist because they've captured, animals and that sort of thing, plants, and engraved it or drew it in the rock art, and of course now they don't exist. So it's telling the story for us in Australia, 65,000 years. And so, and what it means to be addressed in the plans of management, they need to be able to be confident that they can be engaged in managing those values and the conservation of those values and the biodiversity in general and ecosystems within it. Now, examples of good practice of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity is the CBD. So I'm just going to quickly go through this. The CBD has the convention, and in Articles 8J on traditional knowledge and 10C on customary sustainable use of resources, with an open working group meeting every 2 years under the 8J to address concerns and promote these issues so that it is reflected across all of the decisions, all of the targets and the policies that the CBD develop. There's an International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and that is for the IPLCs, the Indigenous Peoples and local communities, working with state parties, NGOs and other stakeholders. And they have been in place for at least 25 years. I've only been there for 12 of those 25 years. Co-development of a number of documents from an Indigenous perspective, and I'll touch on those as well, where state parties desperate for some sort of guidance from an Indigenous perspective. So we have developed a number of guidelines for them to be able to work with to make it easier for them. Having a complementary edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook report by the state parties every 5 years, but it didn't really reflect the Indigenous people's contribution to the conservation of the biodiversity and ecosystems. So we now have 2 of those. So the first one was produced to line up with the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and it was peer reviewed. It was set against the Aichi targets. There were 20 of those, and what we did was looking at the communities around the globe, the Indigenous communities around the globe that could address one of those with a case study, one of those targets with a case study. And so, people wrote specifically about alien species. I wrote about alien species. Others wrote about, traditional knowledge. Others wrote about, their customary use of, plants and materials and things like that. So we were giving our own story from an Indigenous point of view about the work that we were doing to conserve and manage the environment and the biodiversity and ecosystems. So these are the sample of the guidelines they've been developed by the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the IIFB, and the Indigenous Focal Point of the CBD Secretariat. These are a copy of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks Volumes 1 and 2, and they're available on the net. So if you just typed in Local Biodiversity Outlook, you will get Volume 1 and Volume 2 as well. We're now working on Volume 3, which will be out in the next year or two. I'm not sure whether this slide is in the wrong place, but Australia has 20 World Heritage places across our country, and a couple down in Macquarie Island and Heard Island and Norfolk Island. So they are sort of out of the mainland or Tasmania, but yes, they are certainly part of the World Heritage properties that we have. As I said, the the World Heritage, UNESCO World Heritage, they have a convention, they have operational guidelines, they have an Indigenous engagement policy, but it's not implemented effectively. They have a cultural policy, again, it doesn't involve or doesn't seem to be written there for Indigenous cultural values. The report, as I said, Our Common Dignity, was presented to the World Heritage Committee in 2016. The advisory bodies are IUCN, ICOMOS and ICROM, and they advise the World Heritage Committee on the values of the place and the condition, and also make a recommendation as to whether or not it meets the criterion for a listing under the World Heritage Convention. And there's also another Indigenous network that's set up, which I chair, which is the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage. And we are very, very young in our infancy, and so we are still finding our feet. But we are working as hard as we can to make a difference for Indigenous peoples with properties that are listed in the World Heritage List. The other column is a little bit about that forum, and we have been, as I said, used as a voice for the Indigenous peoples to voice their concerns to the World Heritage Committee, which meets every year, and every 5 years a property has to report on the state of the conservation of that property, and making sure that the values have not been minimised or damaged or destroyed in any way. This is my own traditional group now, the Eastern Gugunyalanji. We were approached by the Queensland government for the handback of 4 national parks, and as part of that I wrote the Mudgee Code of Practice to ensure that anybody that wanted to come and do business with us were following our cultural protocols and also sort of our ethical standards that we would like them to follow. So the World Heritage listing for the Wet Tropics of Queensland World Heritage Area was in 1988. There was no consultation done with Bumma. Bumma are the local people, and so it's listed for its natural values only. And there were restrictions where the Bumma could live within the national park because of the many layers of protection listings, at the world, federal and state levels, etc. It's managed by an authority. I just happen to chair that Wet Tropics Management Authority Board, who is supporting the inclusion of Indigenous values to be included in the listing in the outstanding universal value. The whole part of the handback was built on our determination, our history of 60,000 years in the rainforest, our native title determination, all the ILUAs that we have in place since 2007, and that, sort of our organisation that acts on behalf of us and for our interest was established by Elders Group. So our focus is building on that determination and ILUA signing, and Jabalbina, which is the name of our organisation, Jabalbina Yalanji Aboriginal Corporation. Their focus is to empower Eastern Gugunyalanji Bumma and build our capacities, build the capacity of the people within the communities. We have 3 clans, one along the coast, which is where I come from, and my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother. So that is our traditional country, and we are called Jalanjiwara. Nungulwara is up in the mountains, and Yalanjiwara are people that are south of Mosman, and that takes in another port, which is Port Douglas, which is a very big tourist town. And so we had IPAs, what we call IPAs, and they're Indigenous Protected Areas. Each clan had to have their IPA plans, but we're finding now that it is probably better if we amalgamate all of those plans into one big, because we didn't have rangers before, and now we've got enough rangers to go right across the country to implement the management plan for the IPAs and conserve all those values there. As I said, the Queensland government came to us and said they wanted to negotiate with us which would take 2 years. It ended up for our 4 national parks, 3 of them on land and 1 in the marine national park. And instead of 2 years, it took 4 years. So we negotiated with the state, with the agency, which is called QPWS, Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, because they were managing all of those national parks. And so these are the 4 national parks. Hope Island, as I said, was in the marine. It's got 3 different sites as included in that national park. Black Mountain, that's north of the, just outside of the wet tropics boundary. And that's, I'm talking about rainforest boundary. Nungalbulo, which is right in the middle of it, and that's part of the Daintree as well, the Daintree National Park. So some of these places are very well known, particularly the Daintree and Port Douglas, as I mentioned before. So a lot of tourists coming up through the wet tropics up into that area. We went through clan governance processes to select members, and I was fortunate enough to be selected by my elders to be one of 2, I think it was, yes, people from that clan group to be on the negotiating team. As I said, it took 4 years. We got our hand back and had our hand back ceremony in September 2021. But we had an overriding document, a legal document, which was an Indigenous Management Agreement. And the other documents that we had, as I said, I wrote the Mudgee Code of Practice because we just wanted to make sure that everybody was going to be very consistent in the way that they worked with us. We had a tourism strategy that was developed. We still have these, a cultural heritage management plan. We did a report and consultation on what were the aspirations of the EKY, which is the Eastern Gugunyalanji people. We have a fire strategy, and that includes fire management across the parks, and a pest management strategy. So we do have, feral animals and feral plants everywhere. So we do have to make sure that we're trying to manage those as best we can. This is the Mudgee Code. Mudgee means boss or rainforest. So the rainforest is our boss. So part of it was to look at, sort of the protocols, as I said, and the ethical standards. So we, while we have lived on, cared for, and continue to survive on Bubble and Jalan, Bubble being land, Jalan sea. And so we've been there, as I said, for at least 60,000 years. The rainforest Bama, are guaranteed. We are guaranteed the basic rights under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we want to see implemented in action for future benefit of EKY rainforest Bama. That's all our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. So the Mudgee Code, as I said, is rainforest or boss, and it sets out a way we will work with others and how we expect them to work with us when they want to do business with us, particularly research, but also if tourism industry is coming through, and how they will work with us and use us as the interpreters and not them getting their knowledge from the internet. This is just a quick snapshot of all the different organisations. The colours sort of tell you that that's one organisation. Then there's other, other groups that we work with, local councils, state and Commonwealth council, government, sorry. So yeah, that's just a snapshot of where we all are. And so this is a example of best practice wet tropics rainforest Aboriginal peoples and their engagement in the World Heritage Management to conserve, preserve and protect the outstanding universal values. Our collective journey started back when in the mid-1980s, there started to be clearing of the rainforest. A real estate person had actually bought up a lot of the land, a developer bought up a lot of the land and just started bulldozing down all the rainforest trees. And so all along this journey, along this line, there are really important things that we've been engaged in, and either with government or with the authority or with others, that has sort of made a change in the way that we were moving forward to make sure that everything was going well. The RAPT is a Rainforest Aboriginal Peoples think tank. And again, there were a number of us that were actually part of that. It's a strategic think tank. So when I became chair of the Management Authorities Board, which is the main authority, I was on the RAPT, but I had to step off. Otherwise, it was conflicts of interest. But the RAPT has been involved in a number of different things to look at, sort of where we're going and, sort of ensure that Indigenous peoples, rainforest Aboriginal peoples, were engaged throughout the whole processes. So one of the things they did was look at the cultural values that have been listed on the National Heritage List. And for a while, I was also part of that, which was a steering committee for the Cultural Heritage Management Plan. As chair, we also think that we could do better in the way that we are consulting with rainforest Aboriginal peoples. This is just a map to show you that blue area is the broader wet tropics bioregion, and that's 1 million, it's nearly 2 million hectares. The wet tropics is on the right side, and that dark green is the World Heritage Area. So that's nearly 900,000 hectares. So they were the same people that had traditional custodian and sort of interests and rights across both areas. So in looking at sort of establishing a joint advisory committee to provide advice to both bodies to address a strategic approach to the management and conservation of the values of the wet tropics range. So the other examples of Indigenous engagement in Australia for the management conservation of lands and waters are Indigenous protected areas. And this is a map that was produced last December. The red is a protected area, an IPA, and we have about 85 or between 85 and 90, I can't read, it's so small. But it's also going across waters now. So we're getting sea country Indigenous protected areas. The leaflet on the side is looking at sort of some of the work that these rangers do. Attached to every IPA are rangers, but also rangers exist outside of the IPAs. So there's nearly 1,000 rangers across the countryside looking at doing the conservation, management and protection of not only cultural values but the biodiversity and ecosystems as well. The Great Barrier Reef, World Heritage, and it turned into this. So it's a framework that is for monitoring the health and well-being of people, but also the country's health, and looking broader about heritage and knowledge, culture and community, education and empowerment, and economics. So we have sort of enabling main focus areas of country health, people's health, and empowerment and economics. And then, sort of the others are there because they're important as well, but they're all part of the Strong Peoples, Strong Country framework. That's being tested now. It has 6 hubs and 45 attributes there to get indicators. We also did some work with doing data sharing agreements, and this was to inform people before going out and getting their consent around data sharing, and talking about how really it was there to inform, sort of not so much the Indigenous peoples, but certainly the peoples that are working within the administration that had no real knowledge about the traditional owners of the reef. This is another reef project that I chaired. It's integrated monitoring and reporting, and this is under this program we are trialling that Strong People, Strong Country monitoring program. This is the RIMREP. Eventually it will all end up in RIMREP because that will be the integrated monitoring and reporting program for the reef, held at the reef authority level. So that is the management body under legislation. And so eventually it's still being built, the database is still being built, but we have a traditional owner input into that, and this is our journey of how we're going to get that input and where we're going to get data from. Now this moves on to the most recent part of the reef work. That's the steering group, of which again I chair. We're looking at all of the World Heritage Area for the Great Barrier Reef, and that is as long as the country of Italy. And so it's a very long country, and we have over 70 traditional owner groups on land that has responsibility for that marine area as well. The journey, there have been several reports with recommendations and actions that weren't picked up in any report because I just sat on the shelf. So what we did was actually have a facilitator and help us work through all of that. We have been working on that since 2019. We launched it in 2022. I think it was 2022. But yes, all of that information there has been covered. So we're working to establish a task force that will have a governing body, which is co-chaired and has 5 members, 2 co-chairs, 1 male, 1 female, and 5 members. And underneath it sits the co-ord unit, which will have a general manager, and we are advertising for these higher level positions right now, so recruitment will take place in the next week or so. The task force or the co-ord unit's job is to actually go out and do consultation with all the traditional owner groups along the reef, and to find out, sort of what is it they want in the Sea Country Alliance, because that's the only target that we have to meet in the Reef 2050 plan. So well and truly before 2050, we are trying to get established a Sea Country Alliance, but there's a lot of work to do before that. So it's about a 3-year consultation project, and they will go out and speak with everybody, get their input, sift through it, work it out, sort of what's feasible, what's not feasible, looking at how they can come to some sort of a consensus as to what, where, when, who, and everything else will the Sea Country Alliance be formed. We have a futures fund, so the two levels of government, the Commonwealth Government in Australia and the State Government of Queensland and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation have committed $10 million each. That is to actually run and support the Sea Country Alliance over time. So it's not that we can spend that $30 million. That's a futures fund. We are building that to ensure that we do have funding to be able to operate in the long term sustainably. And finally, just some national ethics guidelines and community level best practice for Indigenous research. In Australia, we have the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research. We also have a peak body called IATSIS, and that's the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and they have just released in 2022 the new Code of Ethics. And they've built on other versions as well. Ask First is a very simple thing of going and asking people, and if you don't know who to ask, you go to a peak body or you go to someone who has been working in the area, and you just need to ask people. Of course, the Mudgee Code, I talked about the Mudgee Code, that's at a community level. This is also at a national level beyond Guarding Ground, and the Dream Shield, and that's looking at IP and copyright. And so Australia's going through a process of consultation rounds at the moment to look at developing and establishing specific legislation for Indigenous cultural intellectual property, which will cover all of those other areas such as FPIC, such as data sharing agreements, such as copyright, such as patents and trademarks and all the rest of it. So all of those may be for art and those sorts of things, but it also applies to knowledge. So I want to thank you for listening. That's Daintree Heads, where my mother was born, and Kubin on Moa Island in the Torres Strait, where my father was from. So thank you very much. Bye.